This is one of the most extraordinary collisions between politics, law, and broadcasting ethics in decades. Donald Trump's threat to sue the BBC for variously £1 billion and 6 million is over the doctored Panorama edit is not only a personal vendetta but a moment of reckoning for a public institution that has long been insulated by its own sense of moral infallibility. Beginning with the facts, the BBC did splice two parts of Trump's January the 6th speech together, words separated by nearly an hour to create the illusion he was calling for insurrection. In truth, the omitted section contained the phrase peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. That's not journalistic compression, that is distortion. And it was, as the BBC chairman Samir Shah conceded, an error of judgment which gave the impression of a direct call for violent action. The fact that the Director General and the head of BBC News resigned immediately after this became public tells its own story. The fact that they knew about this for months before tells you another story. Trump's legal team, led by Alejandro Brito, has now issued a letter demanding three things: a full retraction of public apology and financial compensation. The deadline is Friday. The tone is pure Trump, grandiose and menacing. Whether or not he succeeds in Florida's courts, where the suit will be filed, is almost secondary. His goal is to humiliate the BBC, to force it to kneel before his narrative, and to re-establish himself as the aggrieved victim of media conspiracy. But the deeper scandal lies not in the courtroom, but in Broadcasting House. The BBC's leadership has been collapsing under the weight of its own self-righteousness, a moral vanity that confuses impartiality with moral superiority. For years, critics have accused the BBC of practicing a subtle but pervasive ideological bias, anti-Trump, anti-Israel, pro-EU, doctrinally progressive on every social issue. Instead of engaging in serious introspection, its executives have hidden behind the phrase, "lessons will be learned," which has become the BBC's own liturgical confession. Now, of course, I'm in a very odd position, as I agree with many of the BBC's biases, but I don't agree with its claims to be infallible. I don't agree with its absurdity about fairness, and I don't agree with its deceit. If you want to be anti-Trump, you say so. If you want to be anti-Israel, you say so. I'm not anti-Israel, but I am anti the current Israeli government. I am defiantly pro-EU. I am progressive on a lot of social issues. But that doesn't mean that I support the BBC's editing of its coverage of Trump. I don't. I think it's appalling. Trump's fury has merely exposed what many viewers already suspected. When Deborah Turnus and Tim Davie resigned, they didn't do so because of one bad edit. They left because of a culture of moral exceptionism that has rotted the foundations. As insiders now admit, there is now an internal caste system, a metropolitan graduate elite that prizes ideological virtue above intellectual discipline. Newsrooms speak the language of diversity but enforce conformity. The result is what Danny Cohen, a former BBC television director, calls institutional groupthink. I worked for the BBC for a while, and I found it perfectly reasonable. What I found extraordinary was the way it cut corners, and I never once received a a contract until I was on a program called The Circle for Channel 4, and then suddenly it was as if I was too famous to avoid a contract. Suddenly contracts started pouring at me. What makes this air so dangerous, so politically dangerous, is that the BBC has become an easy target. Nigel Farage calls it election interference, and Kemi Badenoch insists that reform is long overdue. Ed Davey defends it as a beacon of truth, but even its friends cannot ignore that trust has been damaged at a time when the BBC is negotiating the renewal of its charter and its funding model. To cry to abolish the licence fee now is no longer something that is confined to the right wing. Legally, Trump's chances of winning such an enormous sum are slim, but this case is potent as theatre. He will use this to reinforce his narrative that the fake news establishment manipulates democracy. The irony is that by editing his speech, the BBC has handed him the very proof he needed. The BBC is not beyond redemption, but it must abandon its pious insistence that impartiality is somehow in its DNA. It's not. Impartiality is not a genetic trait. It is a discipline constantly practiced and policed. If the BBC cannot rediscover that discipline, it will not survive the next charter review, nor deserve to. Trump's billion-dollar lawsuit may never reach a Florida courtroom, of course, but in the court of public opinion, that verdict is already brutal. The BBC's blinkered self-righteousness has done what decades of political hostility never could. It has made Donald Trump look, for once, like the wronged party.